First of all, I'm really impressed at the number of people who've come out on a Thursday evening, on a cold Thursday evening here in London, and I'm really happy to be able to present in front of so many people from various different sectors here in the UK. So first of all, do people know what Drupal is? Do people know what open source is? Okay, excellent. That helps. Anyone want a quick explanation on either? Yes. Okay, so open source is software that is free to use, modify, and distribute, essentially. And Drupal is a content management system, and it runs. It's sort of like WordPress, but it runs about 3% of the internet. And also in terms of my talks, I prefer questions and answers than presentations. So hopefully keep those questions going, and hopefully there'll be times for some interesting questions leading from my presentation. So this is me. I am president of OpenConcept, which is a web development company in Ottawa. We are a Drupal development firm. I'm also the Drupal 8 core accessibility maintainer. There's actually another maintainer for Drupal 8, Andrew McPherson. He's up in Edinburgh, so it's unusual for the two of us to be in the same country at the same time. But Andrew's done a lot of wonderful stuff with Drupal as well, and hopefully at some point in the future he'll come down and have an opportunity to be part of this meetup as well. I'm also a co-founder of Aliyao, which is an accessibility unconference or an accessibility event similar to this in Ottawa. It's just a lot smaller because Ottawa is a little bit smaller than London. My company is a B Corp, so we're a certified B company. We try and go off and be a triple bottom line company, try and be good for the planet. We also do a lot of work around accessibility as part of our mandate to try and make the world better, not just make a lot of money. Not that we make a lot of money, but and finally, I'm an amateur photographer, and I take a lot of pictures, including pictures like this one here of a monkey that was hanging out in Sri Lanka. For people who are low vision or blind, all of my slides will include monkeys because I took a lot of them, and I did this slide presentation on the plane, and I had not a lot of visual resources, but I did have a lot of pictures of monkeys. So the first thing I want to go off and say is that people have views about open source as being sort of fringy and something that is not something that it's a risky thing to take on. And I think that it used to be the case 20 years ago that was when we were first involved with open source software that was the case. But at this point, almost every organization around the world is using open source software in one form or another. Almost every website has some form of open source software that they're using, whether it's a framework like Bootstrap that they're using to drive their website. Maybe it's the language that the software is running in, like PHP or .NET now is open source. And there's a lot of giants that are now getting involved in open source because it has proved to be so successful. So does everyone know what GitHub is? So GitHub is a big open source repository of information, and Microsoft just bought GitHub for I don't know how many billions of dollars, and the largest contributor of open source on GitHub of all the world is Microsoft. Microsoft is now promoting open source just like they're promoting accessibility. They're in the last 2 years, they've really sort of turned around a lot of what they've done and are doing a lot more to go off and to address both accessibility and open source because they see some real advantages to that. One of the things that accessibility does is it tends to go off and drive down the cost, not just because it's free for people to use, modify, and download and distribute, but it's software that allows you to, if you find a pattern that works, you can distribute it to other people. You can work with a community of people. So you're not necessarily going to be the only one who's maintaining a piece of software and having to push that forward. You've got a whole community you can draw on to try and find answers to a particular problem you're running into. So it's something that that in many ways helps to distribute the costs of managing any piece of software. Does anyone know about the bus? Was it the bus factor or the lottery factory? For you might have a great site that you developed, or you've got a really kick-ass team of developers, but if one of them gets hit by a bus or wins a lottery, you might be really stuck. And if you're building with a community, you're distributing that out. So there's more people, more geniuses you can draw on to go off and to make sure that your product is more viable over the long term. And a lot of organizations are seeing that. And the other thing is just that that software moves so quickly, and the internet has really propelled the rate with which change happens, and it's hard to I mean, how many people have played with the JavaScript front end implementations, React or Angular? It's turning everything upside down in a lot of ways. These frameworks are challenging a lot of our existing paradigms, and this is something that's not. I mean, it's relatively new, but 10 years ago was when the iPhone was just first sort of commercially viable, and you think about our society now. And does anyone here not have a smartphone in their pocket? Okay, so it's we're looking at in 10 years' time, perhaps it'll be augmented reality or virtual reality that we're looking at and looking at how this is so just the rate of change is so fast, and trying to keep up with this requires us to use libraries and to work together in order to go off and to try and make sure that we're able to accomplish the task we're looking for. Let's see. So yes, all the cool kids are doing it. So I've got a monkey crawling up a vine here. Accessibility is advanced through people sharing their knowledge. Much like events like this, accessibility events, our knowledge is advanced by sharing what we know and learning from each other. The open source community in most cases is very much like this. People look at what they've done, they look at examples, they find what works, they find what doesn't, they talk to each other at conferences and other events, and they learn through being engaged in the community. Open source has disrupted a lot of industries. So, and the accessibility industry is just one other industry that has been disrupted or is in the process of being disrupted by open source. Has anyone heard about Axe Core? So Axe Core is a really neat library that was started by DQ Systems, that's open source and is being used for a lot of automated testing tools, but it's also built into Google Lighthouse. Do people know what Google Lighthouse is? Google Lighthouse is a great tool that allows you to do a quick audit of a quick review of your website with Axe Core, and they've got a limited number of tests that they use to try and evaluate that. But Google is taking the work that DQ Systems has done, embedded that into Google Lighthouse, and is then trying to provide ways to leverage those results in a way to go off and make it easier for people to understand how they can improve accessibility, and also how they can improve the search engine optimization and performance. They're trying to bundle it into a few things so that it becomes part of a regular process that people can go off and make the experience better for their users by going off and using these tools and generating these reports to make it easier. So that's, Axe Core is open source. There's also other tools that are released on GitHub that are being used widely in the community. There's a color contrast or the contrast ratio tool that's a quite good way to go off and evaluate whether or not your color contrast is effective or not. It allows you to with the color contrast ratio tool in GitHub put in both the RGB color definitions, hex color definitions, and the HSL definitions, whatever the heck that is, but various other color definitions that allow you to go off into that you might want to use in your CSS to define your website. So there's also a great one called Tangaroo that allows you to go off and to take an image, and if your color contrast is, if you take your color contrast combination and you put them in there, and you're not sure how to go off and meet your WCAG 2.0 AA requirements, the Tangaroo gives you a whole bunch of various color options that are very close to the one you're working for. So if a client gives you a color, a style guide that doesn't quite work, you can go off and often find a color that's close enough, and they might not know that you're actually not, you're varying from what they've given you. So you can use Tangaroo for that. There's also things like Pally, which is another accessibility checking tool, and the BBC has an accessibility tool that's up on GitHub. You can also find things like there's an alley style guide that was developed by Carrie Fisher, who I think designed this shirt. This is an Alley Cats t-shirt that I'm wearing, and so there's that. There's the Alley projects. There's a lot of stuff that's being done with open source or with open documentation, trying to go off and get people to share and collaborate with each other in order to go off and to make accessibility easier and to get more people on board with a best practice. So one of the, I think that the accessibility industry has to rethink a few things. And one of the problems is that people tend to work in isolation, and there's a lot of people in organizations who've been doing accessibility work for a long time and know a particular set of tools, but don't necessarily have the time or energy to be able to keep up with the latest area standards, with WCAG 2.1, with the the new dynamic elements that are added in. They're like just trying to keep up with the changes of the technology is difficult, especially when people are always getting pressured to do more with less. So trying to go off and work together is going to be quite important in order to try and find ways to be able to work, to accomplish more for less. Many organizations are using open source tools like Drupal, but unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't get involved. They go off and use the tools, and then they walk away. Hopefully it sets up and it accomplishes their immediate requirements, and then they might, if there's a problem with it they run into, they'll go off and hack the code that they've got. Because it's open source, they can do that, but they never contribute anything back to the open source community to try and make that original library better. There's a case study I like to go off and raise with Drupal 8. I guess I think it was like 4 years ago, a guy named Vincenzo Rabano from Italy was a high school student who was working on Drupal. He was blind, still is, and he ran into a bunch of errors and started to get involved in the Drupal community and posting issues and bugs in Drupal. And as an individual, in the year before he started university, he was able to go off and be more involved and more active in addressing accessibility issues in Drupal 8. He's more involved than all of the governments in the world combined. And given the number of organizations that use Drupal, a lot of them are government, including the White House, including the Queen's website, including the Ontario website. Like a lot of websites use Drupal, but there hasn't been a tendency of people giving back. So if one single individual as a student can contribute more than all of the governments in the world combined, there's a structural problem that needs to be addressed. And I think that we have to also try and make sure that we're doing what we can to keep up with the best practices and improve our best practices, because the assistive technology and the browsers and the standards are changing, and so the best practices need to keep up with them, and we need to be actively involved as a community to try and see that we're doing more with that. Another thing is all software is built with libraries, and we don't often think about this often enough, but there are layers and layers of software involved in driving the web. And if so much of the accessibility industry has been focused on site-specific fixes. And if you're fixing a problem for your particular website, then the next time there's an update to the software that you're using, whether there's a security release or there's a new version of the module that has some additional features that you're looking for, whenever you update that software library, then you're going to lose all of those enhancements and changes that you've made, or it's going to cost you a lot to go off and to reapply all the patches that you've created. So, trying to get people to think about those libraries and to think about how to go off and fix the problem at the source. How do we try and make sure that we're not simply going and addressing our own needs, but if we can think a little bit larger and think about the ways that we can go off and fix the systems that we're using and that we're leveraging for our websites. And there are, these libraries are also evolving and changing. How do we try and make sure that those libraries and the people who are involved in creating them are aware about accessibility and making sure that we are they're making good decisions as new features are being added. So being involved in those communities is quite an important step. So I've been very active in the Drupal community for the last decade, and there's been surprised at the amount of funding that is going towards to site-specific fixes. Like the whole accessibility industry is geared to fixing individual websites, and whether it's doing audits or remediation of individual websites. There's almost no funding or resources looking at the larger challenge of the systems that we're using, whether it's tools like Drupal or things like Bootstrap that are used by millions of websites, or CK Editor. There's so many libraries that are using to drive the web, but there's no money going to try and support the accessibility improvements and refinements in these general libraries. If we were able to go off and to have testing and involvement to make sure that those those tools are that we're able to test that, I think we'd be much better off. Because if a developer is starting with an accessible tool set, then it's much easier for them to take that tool and to apply it, and instead of having to go off and to take an inaccessible tool, learn what the barriers are with that, and then fix those problems before they apply it in their website. It's a much easier way for people to learn how to do things right if they have a good example to start from. So there's definitely lots of challenges with open source, like with any software library. There are one of the big challenges is dealing with critical mass. There's lots of software out there that is open source. GitHub is filled with all kinds of open source libraries that people have set up. A lot of software doesn't have critical mass to be supported, and that's not just open source software. Software is complicated. You need to go off and to have people who are developers and users. You need to have the economic and cultural movement behind that, so that you're able to ensure that your software that you're building your site on is going to be there in 3 or 5 years' time. If you're developing your website on an interesting looking project that's got 5 developers in it, well, they might get hired by Google next week, and you're stuck with a piece of software that nobody's maintaining, and you're stuck trying to go off and to juggle with how do you deal with the security updates, how do you deal with those feature enhancements and all the bugs that come out. So that's certainly one challenge that's there with open source. procurement in many organizations is difficult as well. A lot of organizations don't know how to procure free software. How do you buy something that's free? It takes, what are the legal issues around that? It's something that a lot of organizations have been struggling with. I don't think that it's that difficult, but it certainly is a change of mindset when people are used to buying a product as opposed to supporting a service. So there's changes on that front. I think that the more you can look to a precedent, the more you can try and find ways where other government departments have been able to leverage open source, the better it is. It's been nice to go off and to see that so many government agencies are signing on to things like the Open Government Partnership, and looking at the work that the GDS has been doing to both talk about open source and release code under open source. President Obama, when he was in office, talked about a shared first mandate, trying to go off and to make the defaults of the software that they develop open for people to go off and to leverage. So this is, again, there's some ways that we can make it easier for people to go off and to adopt it and overcome some of the shortfalls for people who are trying to explore using more collaborative software. I think that a lot of people, when they're getting involved in any software problem, tend to think of it as a lot of developers aren't very keen to ask others for help. They're people who want to often sort of solve the problem on their own and fix the puzzle. And I think that with a lot of open source software, it's useful to think about this as a community effort. And so if the documentation isn't very good, maybe get involved in trying to improve the documentation. If there's, or ask questions, like even if there's something that you should be able to get working, but you can't find a way to make it work, that asking questions and posting bugs is a way to go off and make it easier for other people who may not necessarily understand that there's a like for every one person who doesn't understand it and posts a question, there's 10 people who saw that same problem and just never bothered to go off and to post a question. They moved on to another set of code or threw up their hands in frustration or just handed it on to somebody else to address. There are I think that we, back when I started my business 20 years ago, the web was something that you could conceivably go off and manage as an individual or a small team. But now the web is so complicated. You've got so many different roles, and just the growth of the user research, usability spectrum is just it's huge. And 20 years ago there wasn't as much of a it wasn't as complicated. Sites were not expected to go off and have a unique designer who has experience with usability, and we're not comparing ourselves to Apple so trying to go off and realize that accessibility has also gotten more complicated, and that we can't necessarily solve all of these problems on our own. We need to be able to draw on other people with their expertise. And fortunately, with an open source community, you actually have other people you can reach out to. You can be involved in the discussion forums, whether it's on Slack, or Rocket Chat, or in the issue queues. There's ways that you can go off and engage with others to try and get the answers you're looking for. And often you'll get a response in a fairly prompt manner. So not always, but often. Yeah, user experience is changing, the browsers are changing, and we need as much help as we can to go off and be able to implement these. How many people are using automated tools in their testing structure? They're quite handy, but it's something that if you can tie in tools like Axe Core into your development structure and actually have your developers have a red light when new accessibility issues start popping up, it's something that you can, the earlier you can go off and identify an accessibility problem, the less expensive it's going to be. So how do you make sure that the developers know that they've added a new problem with a commit? how do you make sure that they get that red flag so that you're not having to wait till it gets to a QA person to go off and to do the evaluation. You've got a bot that's able to go off and to count the number of errors, the simple errors, the ones that an automated tool like AxScore can go off and generate. And any of the automated accessibility tools, I mean, they're good. They need to be used and built into a general structure of how you're evaluating your websites. But I think that the GDS did a survey, and I think it was 25%, 30% was the top or something like that. Like there's really not that many. It's certainly not the majority of accessibility errors that are caught by any of the auditing tools that are out there right now. But it's worthwhile trying to catch that 30% of errors that can be identified by the better automated accessibility tools. So this is a picture of a monkey stealing a water bottle. It's a very feisty little monkey. Open source is about community. It's about trying to go off and build a commons around a particular piece of software, a particular chunk of intellectual property. And if people are just taking from that commons, then they're going to be suffering, we're all going to suffer the tragedy of the commons. We need to find ways to give back so that we're not like this cheeky monkey that's stealing the water bottle from the thirsty tourist. I think that there's lots of ways for people to get involved and to contribute back. Some of that is in terms of actual technical skills, whether it's writing bug fixes or even submitting submitting bugs to these issue queues. Part of it's also looking to write documentation, be able to be an advocate, to make things easier for people to understand, to summarize issues. There's lots of ways that people of a range of different skills can be involved in order to make these accessibility products, these open source products more accessible. There's lots that can be done, and most people don't take the time to do that and don't work it into their daily operations and daily workflow, so that when they run into an issue that they actually take the time right there and then to go off and to report the issue or to find the bug in the issue queue for the library that they're using. But if we can build it into our workflow, it's something that will save us time in the long run. Right now, Drupal is the most accessible CMS out of the blocks. It's the most accessible open source content management system for sure. WordPress is coming along quickly, and I am very biased, but I have yet to find somebody else go off and tell me that there's another open source or another enterprise content management system that is more accessible than Drupal. That being said, we've got a long ways to go, and it's trying to build in accessibility by default takes a lot of work and a lot of time. But Drupal keeps changing and evolving, and there's new features that are being added all the time. Drupal 9 will be coming out in 2020, and trying to go off and deal with a whole flood of new features that'll be added to make it easier for people to go off and to use and modify. And it took, in order to go off and to achieve that, it did take a bunch of tenacious volunteers in order to go off and to make that better. That there was for Drupal 8, I think there's over 400 people who contributed to the issue queue over the lifespan of the project. And a lot of companies invested quite a lot of time to go off and to make that better, including OpenConcept, of course. But I think that it also took leadership from the top. That Dries, who's the founder of Drupal, has been quite active or quite open and talking about accessibility. There's other people in the leadership team who've also been very involved in trying to go off and to make it a priority. And it does take leadership from the top to go off and to make it important for everyone throughout the chain to go off and to see this as something that's important to them. And having technical people is important as well. People who understand those new technologies. People heard about the problems with Gutenberg and accessibility. It was a fairly big deal this fall for people in the WordPress community, and still a big deal. And I think one of the problems with that is that there's a shift to JavaScript front end, and there's not enough accessibility people who know JavaScript. And this is the case in the Drupal community as well. There aren't enough people who know accessibility who are also kick-ass JavaScript people. We need as accessibility or as open source communities, we need people who have skills in both areas, and we don't have enough of those. Yeah, we need to do work on WCAG 2.1. We've done a lot of work on ATAG. Do people know what ATAG is? ATAG is the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines. It's a great document that outlines ways that a CMS can be used as both as something that people who have disabilities should be able to use. That's part A of ATAG, but also should help people go off and create more accessible content. So content authors should be helped by their content management system to produce more accessible content. And I don't think there's any other content management system that's done as much to go off and to include ATAG into the framework of its core implementation. This is a monkey sitting on some blocks. And I think that again, looking at if you have building blocks that you can trust, it also helps. As people who've looked at accessibility, if you don't know how a system is built, if you have to evaluate every page uniquely, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to go off and to do that. If you can know that there's a system that's used to create various different forms, you can evaluate one form and then know that all of the other forms on the website are probably produced in the same way. And so you don't have to evaluate each page uniquely. You can go off and look at the elements and the pieces that are generated by the system and be able to build from that. So yeah, having trustworthy blocks that you can evaluate once and build on is really quite useful. I also really advocate for content management systems and other tools to have a public issue queue to talk about accessibility issues. Again, I've talked about GitHub earlier. I really like GitHub in a lot of ways. They don't have a public issue queue for accessibility issues. So how do you know that there's a problem with their site that has been reported by somebody else? For the longest time, JAWS didn't have a public issue queue either. They do now in the last year, but how do you know that the issue that you're having is with JAWS, or is it a problem that you're having with your code? If you don't have a public issue queue, you can't know whether or not it's your problem or a problem that's generally known in the community. So having that open issue queue is a really important piece of having building blocks that you can rely on in order to go off and evaluate them and know what is your problem specific to your code and your process, and what's a general problem that affects everyone. So these are monkeys picking bugs off of each other, because that's what they spend a lot of time doing. And just like these monkeys, there's a lot of bugs in software, and we can't forget that there's bugs in software. There's even with more sophisticated testing tools and systems, people will produce bugs, and it will there'll be things that will be overlooked even with the most comprehensive testing infrastructure. So having people look at and evaluate those bugs, having issue queues, and having spaces for people to give feedback is quite important. And being able to open it up so that more people and more users can go off and get ideas from each other about how to improve the code is useful. Accessibility is a big problem. It's complicated, and we need to work together in order to go off and to start addressing these issues. There are certainly simple issues that we can do, and we know that they're easy to learn and can be applied broadly, and everyone should be working to do that. But there's complicated issues like using area in custom web forms that may be quite complicated, and that might be something that changes when area 1.2 gets released. So it takes a community of people to be able to keep up with the changes with accessibility. So with that, my Twitter handle is mgifford. Mike at OpenConcept is my email address. OpenConcept.ca is my address. You can see more of my issues in the issue queue for Drupal.org there as well. I'm not going to bother to read that out. And I've also got a whole bunch of pictures of monkeys and other things on Flickr, if you want to see those. I had to cut out over 100 different pictures of monkeys that I could not put in these slides. So yes.